most of all, thank you to Gary, Barry, and Mort for being here. Um, I was thinking that I could introduce the evening by saying that a Slavic studies expert, a famous sociologist and a university president, walked into a bookstore, but it sounded like a joke that I didn't have a punchline for, and it doesn't summarize the scope of the issues and matters that I think can be discussed tonight in this really interesting, very important, and incredibly timely book. Um, we'll learn about fundamentalism, not simply in the religious sense, not simply in the philosophic sense, not simply in the political sense, not simply in the economic sense, but as all of those intersect and they affect democracy and the kind of country and perhaps the kind of world in which we live. Except for the fact that I've read this book with care and found it uh, both erudite and incredibly accessible, I would be inclined to say you absolutely have to buy and read this book, but I've learned from this book that I have to stay away from absolutes, lest I be guilty of the principal sin, which is defined by this book. So what I thought we would do is I would turn this over to Barry Glassner, the famous sociologist, and allow him to lead us in a discussion. And at some appropriate time toward the end, we'd have the opportunity for our guests to ask questions, either in the chat or by speaking up and being called on. So thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I'm really looking forward to lots of people buying, reading, and discussing your book. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm really honored to be invited to this event and to start it off with some questions. So let me start with this. The book passionately, and I would say eloquently, argues against fundamentalisms. It's a lot of what it's about. And so Morty and Saul, there might be 2 or 3 people here tonight who've not read the book yet. So I think we should start off by defining what you mean by fundamentalism.
Well, maybe thank you, Barry, and thank you, Bert, for the warm introduction. And maybe I can start because that section of the book, Saul did a lot of research into the history of the term fundamentalism, going back 100 years to interpreting Christian Bible, and Saul can fill you in. But I think a summary of it, Saul, before I turn it over to you, is, Barry, that any fundamentalist thought is one that you believe that you are not open to be dissuaded. You know, Karl Popper, of course, the great philosopher of science, said that almost everything you believe should be falsifiable, but there are some things that simply are not falsifiable, certain things that people believe in their heart and their soul, and people can marshal whatever evidence to the contrary against that point of view, and they're just not going to have it. And I would say one thing, Barry, that one of the early reviewers of the book said, okay, this is against fundamentalism. We should put most of our thinking on the table, be open to be dissuaded, but probably not everything. And somebody said, this person said this great line, that you want to have your mind wide open, but not so wide open that your brain falls out. And there are certain things I believe that they're not on the table for debate. Certain things you believe, Saul, and Barry, I'm sure it's certain things you believe. But if it's most of what you believe, Barry, you got a problem, and democracy has a problem. Saul?
Yes, the crucial thing is the feeling of absolute certainty, and also that the fundamentalist mindset is one where it seems not just that what you say is certainly true, but that it's obvious, and anybody who doesn't see it, well, they're evil or crazy or stupid, or if we're thinking, I'm a Russian specialist, so in the Soviet case it meant you were a foreign agent, or something like that. But there's some nefarious reason why you don't agree. And therefore, difference of opinion, which is fundamental to democracy, the idea that, well, I have my belief, but I don't, God doesn't speak through me, so I might turn out to be wrong. People on my side have been wrong before. God didn't guarantee everything that we say is right. So let's listen to what the other people say. And maybe we're generally right, but every now and then they could contribute something. That is what is ruled out from a fundamentalist, right? There must never be compromise, never be give and take. And, there's no such thing as opinion in the sense of a belief you hold that could turn out in the fullness of time to be mistaken because you can't see the future. There's the certain truth, and then there are people who for bad reason don't see it. But democracy depends on the notion of legitimate difference of opinion.
Great. That leads perfectly into what I was going to ask, which is you're sort of, I don't want to overstate it, but remedy in a way is what you refer to as true dialogue. And I love that part of the book, parts of the book. It appears a few places. And I really like your description of what true dialogue looks like. It has no predetermined end. It takes surprising turns. Participants say things that they hadn't actually known before. I love that part. And you also lay out the requirements for having a real dialogue, specifically where there are major disagreements. One of those is that the parties allow their statements to be provisional, which goes to what you were just saying, Saul. They treat the exchange as a vehicle for arriving at the truth, which is a big distinction between the kind of arguments that go on. They treat the exchange as a vehicle for conducting and achieving a kind of spirit of concord as well. So it's not a battle to see who can win or anything like that. So I love all that. But as I was reading it, I'm thinking, but is that really feasible where the discussion is about foundational principles? And in fact, given what the two of you, especially Mort, just said, is that even what you mean? So is it possible to have a true dialogue in your sense about, say, the existence of God? Or to quote something that you posit in the 4th chapter of the book, that markets never fail. Can we have true dialogue about those kinds of things, foundational principles?
Well, I would say that you pretty much don't have true dialogue about that, but that's why, you don't want to push things so that every issue is about the foundational things. When you have a difference about a given policy, you don't push it to, yeah, but God said, or, it's the, you try to deal with it on its own terms so you don't push it there.
Barry, you raise a really good point, of course, not surprising coming from you about, what does it really mean to foster real dialogue? And obviously it depends on a certain intellectual humility, a mutual respect. As a former college president, for me, as a current, it's hard on campuses. People think they know the answer quite often, and they're more interested in vilifying the opponent than learning from the opponent. So, we didn't mean to imply in the book, and I don't think we do, that it's easy to have real dialogue. But, when you look at what it was like when the three of us grew up, I think, there was more of a common understanding of what was right and what was wrong. And I'm not talking about inherent biblical or other values. I'm talking about the truth. And, I happen to like, growing up, I like Dan Rather. So I watched CBS. I don't know, Saul, you might have watched Peter Jennings, or Barry, you might have watched Tom Brokaw. But, they all so pretty much, I think, told the same version of the truth. Now it was about Vietnam and body counts. Maybe they were all a little duped, and we now have some evidence, of course, that they were. But it didn't really matter which station you watch. It didn't really matter whether you read Time or Newsweek or US News and World Report. I mean, there was a pretty much a standard of truth that people accepted. And now, you know, if your life is Fox News and you're very conservative columnist and all that, or if it's MSNBC and the Progressive, you know, there's just absolutely no hope for exchange. But I think it gets back to one of the fundamentalist tenets of fundamentalism that Saul mentioned, is that, you know, you think you know the truth is obvious. You have to be an idiot not to see it. It's right in front of your eyes. And I didn't grow up thinking about that. And I think that, you know, we didn't need these impartial adjudicators. There were no fake news, but now there really is. And the other thing, Barry, I would say, and you're the great sociologist, I'm not, but as you know better than I do, that you get comforted by living in a silo, in an echo chamber. You know, and I have certain beliefs, and if I can turn on a TV or I can read my columnists in the paper or on blogs, and they're just saying what I already think is the truth, I feel good about myself. I'm not challenged. I'm not, you know, oh my God, was I wrong? It's just like, you know, it's the echo chamber. And now with the changes in technology in recent decades, it's very easy to live in an echo chamber. And I would argue, Saul, that when we grew up, it was harder to live that way. But, you know, it's nice to be comforted, but not at the cost of true meaningful dialogue and really learning from one another.
Yes, I mean, and, you know, when you get into the habit of thinking that, you know, half of the people are wrong and evil, and we got to, you know, have a, you're soon going to have the notion of a one-party state being the only possible one, because if people are just evil, you don't allow them to have influence. And what people forget when they do that is that what inevitably happens, what always happens is that the first time there's a disagreement among the winners, they split and half of them gets, you know, disenfranchised or worse, right? And then they split, which of course, you know, the pattern of the French Revolution, and most of the French revolutionaries lost their heads, right? Literally. You know, in the Russian Revolution. And then this is what happens when, you know, polarization proceeds, unless it stops, of course, that, you know, you think you're on the winning side, but you soon won't be.
Yeah, see, as I'm listening to this, I was pulling out a Reuters poll. You may have seen this a couple of weeks ago, that found that 53% of Republicans still believe that Trump won the 2020 election. 53%, right? Just a couple of weeks ago. So, you know, I understand, if I'm reading your book correctly, that you wouldn't say there's much hope of having, you know, a true dialogue in the strict sense that you're describing, you know, between someone from that 53%, you know, and someone who shares, let's just say, who even shares your desire to find ways to help truth prevail in politics and in other realms. But let's make it, you know, take it a few steps back. You've given a lot of thought to this. What would any dialogue, what would be a productive dialogue? What would be a way to open a conversation, you know, between folks who want the truth to prevail and that 53% of Republicans who don't?
Well, the first thing I would ask is, first of all, you hate the other 47% too, from your side, okay? Not just the 53%, you hate them all, right? You focus, and then of that 53%, you know, can you paraphrase the reasons that they think this? Or are you just assuming it's crazy because that's what your side said? Maybe they're all, do you know some reasons? Could you paraphrase? The test of whether you understand another point of view is whether you can paraphrase it in a way that somebody who holds that point of view would accept as legitimate. Most of the people I know who just laugh at this couldn't say what the rational arguments on the other side. They couldn't be one. That's the more the problem here. People can be wrong without having no grounds whatsoever for their belief, right?
You know, Barry, you mentioned survey, Gallup polls and the like, and as economists, we're trained never to ask people. We observe their behavior. That's how they reveal their true preferences. But one of the things, many things I've learned from you in their 40 years of our friendship is that 30 years of our friendship is that, these polls matter. So let me just give you a couple other ones to really make the point. And these are things I've, again, learned from you. Let's look at the latest poll. So one of them was more than half of Americans recently were asked, what's the greatest threat to America? And I think, boy, when I was a kid, it was Russia, Soviet Union, or China, and more reason. More than half of Americans said the greatest threat to America is other Americans. And that's pretty extreme. And then they asked people, members of each of the political parties, Democrats, Republicans, to describe the members of the other party. Republican, what do you say about Democrats? How do you characterize Republicans? The Democrats, and one of the things they could check off was political opponents, but half of them put enemies. And I think the old days when even George McGovern and Barry Goldwater, or more recently Joe Biden, the compromiser, was friends with John McCain, with the other one. But here's where I think it gets scarier, Barry, and I'm interested in your take on this, is that 1/3 of Americans said that violence was justified to achieve political objectives. And coming from the academy, that when the intelligentsia says that violence is okay, it's the beginning of the end. And we talk about that in detail. And then finally, the most surprising, but probably not for you, having lived in the great state of Oregon for quite a number of years, 1 out of 4 Americans said that they support succession from the Union. And that I think it was the easternmost county or town in Oregon was so embarrassed by Portland and the like that they decided they wanted to join Idaho. And, I don't have a time series on this, Barry, but, when was it the case that 25% of Americans said they were ready to leave the United States of America? I mean, if that doesn't scare you, I don't know what
The Civil War is what that.
Yeah, well, maybe that was the last time that happened, but boy, that is, I think, really scary.
Yeah, so let's pursue this just 1 second. So, well, first, Saul, you're saying, if I understand it right, see what their basis is. See, right? See, don't just say this is crazy, this is wrong. And of course, I agree. That's why I'm an ethnographer. That's what we do, right? But I don't see where that goes in these kinds of cases, right? So in the following sense, go back to your earlier point and a really major point throughout the book. If they give you that answer, whatever it is, and what it would be in this case, what I was talking about is, well, they were jamming the ballot boxes, they threw them off, the back of trucks and stuff like that, right?
No, it would not be. You clearly don't know what the arguments are. And that's part of the problem. If you had known it, you would have thought they were wrong, but you would not have thought they were crazy like that. You're characterizing them in a way that nobody who believed them would characterize them.
See, Barry, I think that's really the point we try to make in the book, is that, I watch CNN just like you do, Barry, and Saul does as well. And, they constantly characterize the conservative position. But of course, it's a very slanted, kind of ridiculous depiction of it. And, which is why I force myself to watch Fox News a couple of hours a week and to hear their thing. And they don't talk exactly with that same language, and did they convince me? No. But can I come away from reading conservative columnists and looking at podcasts from conservatives, with some grudging respect, and maybe my mind doesn't change all that much, but they portray their views a lot better than we portray their views, right? So what's your line about, in a court case? What's the line you used the other day?
Most people think they know what the other side says because they listen to CNN and NBC or they read the New York Times and they tell them what the other side says. And my answer to that is always, well, do you think it would be a fair trial if first the prosecution presented its case, and then when the defense turn was, the prosecution presented what they thought the defense would say? That's
And
what
I would add, when I watch Fox
they
News,
know the other side do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the ways that Fox News characterizes the culture wars and what's going on, the indoctrination mills, academia, they're absolutely ludicrous, you know? So, you know, it's not that you're always convinced, but, you know, I'd rather hear their case presented by them than their case presented by you or Saul.
Okay, with all due respect, you're preaching to a choir. This is what I preach all the time. Some people who are watching this,
I know that.
that they know. And I've spent a lot of hours, probably years, and if you add them up, listening to, the now deceased Rush Limbaugh, I listened to a lot, for my research and writing. I listen to Fox News, watch them a lot. Absolutely agree with your points, but no, that is not what that side says about the election. Sorry, the people, and I don't know how much of the, what percentage of the people who believe, who are in that 50-something%, I don't know. The survey didn't break it down, we could find out. I don't know how many would agree with propositions like the ones I mentioned about stuffing, throwing away ballots and all that kind of stuff. But I do know that a lot of them, again, I don't have the numbers, but we can get them, support recounts because they think that happened. So there are two parts to this. Yes, listening to Fox News is something I preach all the time. Just ask my wife, allow it to be on. I have to listen when she's not around because it's on too much. But that's distinct from this other thing. So let me go on, and we'll come back to some of that, because you also take on liberals in the left, which is great. One argument I found especially compelling in that regard is your position that treating climate change as an existential crisis is wrongheaded, at least when it comes to policy making. I think that's right. So would you talk about that?
Well, there is a chapter 4 in economics, which, since that is my field, I took a little bit of the lead on there. But Saul and I have been working together and teaching together for long enough that we can sort of complete each other's sentences, written or verbally. But there are a whole bunch of things, Barry, that, as you saw in the economics chapter, about how high should the minimum wage go? What do you do about cap and trade to address climate change? What do you do about different power sources to reduce your carbon footprints? What do you do about a whole range of other economic, the top progressive taxes and maybe a wealth tax? And what we argue there is that economists really agree on almost every one of those things I just mentioned. And you don't always get that when you listen to the progressives on the left or the conservatives on the right. But most economists, my field, Saul's a little bit more critical of his field. I don't know how you feel, Barry, about sociology, but in economics, we might have political views. We do have political views, but we really, it's quite unusual to make them apparent, and very importantly, to skew our results to support a particular political view. I think we play it very straight. And that chapter 4 tries to talk about that. The old joke from Harry Truman was, I want a one-armed economist. And they said, why, President Truman? He goes, because they always say, on one hand, do this, on one hand, do that. I only want, that old joke. But the reality is, that's really the media. I mean, most economists, and we have some data in there and footnotes that on healthcare, Obamacare, how to make it better, more effective, on almost everything, we have almost complete unanimity, which is really pretty amazing. But the ideologues on either side, and certainly on the far left, on the far right as well, because they know the truth. Data don't persuade them, right? I mean, you've done so much work on this yourself, Barry. You know, how do you people, if there's a culture of fear, if there's other things about your other books, bodies, whatever it is, you know, people just hold on to something regardless of whether it's true or not. And, you know, we argue in the book that we know a lot about truth, but it gets obscured by fundamentals. I don't know, Saul, what you think of that.
Yeah, I think that the point we were making with climate change is that if you really think there's a problem with climate change, the ideologues are not doing the best thing to address it because they don't understand the concept of trade-offs. It's just, if you just decide to ban nuclear power because it's just bad, well, what are you going to replace it with? In fact, the US, which has not signed any of these agreements, actually lowered its carbon footprint when Germany, which signed them all, raised it. The reason being that in Germany, they also got rid of nuclear power with the same people demanding it. And what do they have to replace it with? It's emission-free nuclear power. They replaced it with things that do have emissions. So you can contrast that, let's say, that's the German Green Party, with the Finnish Green Party, which favors nuclear power precisely because they understand that there are no perfect solutions. But if you really believe there's an existential crisis, and, well, okay, nuclear power has its problems, but if you really think the world is going to end in 10 years or something like that because of climate change, you take it. If you don't take it, it means you don't really believe what you're saying. Or it means that you're using the issue to beat the opposition without really caring about it, which I think is more likely the case when people do that. Because if they cared, they would do the best to solve it, not the best to beat the opposition.
Right, exactly. And if I could just take it another level down, maybe. If you think of it in any way other than an economic and cultural and technological issue, right? I mean, I think that's the three, if we're talking about climate change, right? You're going to be ill-equipped. So I've always found just the word existential connected to it a problem, going down the wrong way. It's not an existential crisis, right? It may be a technological crisis, sociocultural crisis. Certainly, we're going to have an economic analysis to get anywhere with it.
Right.
And if I would take it another step that I think you'll agree, probably, even calling it a moral issue is problematic. Certainly, there are ethical issues, and not leaving a world for another generation, if you believe that, and so forth, right? But if you want to fix it, that's the wrong place to start for an issue like that, right?
Yeah, look, anything can be made an ethical issue. Piling on government debt is leaving it for a future generation. Anything can be, but if you're trying to solve the problem, you don't push it there. You say, what's the best way what are the trade-offs? What's the best way to solve it?
We all want to reduce child poverty, and there's an enormous empirical literature that shows that certain well-meaning liberal policies are completely ineffective. And if there's a moral imperative, it's not to waste resources, right? There is one. And, but yet sometimes people just say, I don't want to see the data. On the other hand, some of the conservatives say, let the markets reign supreme, misreading of Adam Smith and the like. And there's tremendous evidence that the SNAP program, which is the modern equivalent of the food stamps program, as you know, Barry, is extremely effective. But some other government policies are feel-good policies that have very, very little effectiveness. And, one of the parts in the book, we talk about trade-offs, and that if there is a moral imperative, it is to recognize these trade-offs. And again, as I said, to minimize waste. And there's this great Latin proverb I had never heard of, but Saul put it in the book, that, let justice be done, though the world perish. Now, I don't want to live in that world. If you're such a fundamentalist and you believe that, there's no trade-off among the 10 commandments, so why is there a trade-off in one policy versus another. And if the price of your belief is the end of civilization as we know it, then, I didn't sign up for that, so it's not, but people put, as you said, Barry, morality into topic after topic where the dispassionate application of empirical techniques really pretty clear. At least that's what we argue in that chapter 4 on economics.
Good. So seeing that so far, either you've been very polite to me with my questions or my questions are not that bad. I'm going to take it in a direction where I suspect it's not going to go quite that way, but we can hope. So there's a lot in the book endorsing religion and the religious. I read those parts of the book especially carefully, and I tried to read it with the sort of approach that you suggest, hoping not only to learn, which I did, I learned a lot, but also to alter my views, which I didn't. So just bear with me for a minute, okay? Because to make any sense of this, I'm going to have to explain a little bit. So let me start with where I'm with you. I'm with you on the distinction between scientific laws and those based on ethics. You put it well, one does not ask whether the second law of thermodynamics is ethical or unethical. And I'm also with you, and I really love your argument about why no one way of thinking, no single grand theory or grand system can address all questions. As much as sociobiologists and others would beg to differ, no scientific theory, for example, can provide answers to moral dilemmas. But you lost me when you said, if asked how old the world is, our reply is, are we doing geology or something else? No, guys. The only place to turn for answers to how old the world is science. Am I wrong?
Well, I could see why you say that. And I think Saul might actually believe that. I don't, as a observant Jew, person of faith, as you know. And, that's one of my fundamentalisms, Barry. I'm not open to, any real discussion about that. There's some data. There's no data that's going to convince me there's not a benevolent God. And, you guys might debate, a little bit about who's agnostic, who's an atheist, what does it mean to be a Jew? It's like, I'm not going to be a party to it. That's one of the things that makes me who I am. But I should say, stepping back about that chapter, it has certainly been in some of the reviews, the one that people have liked the least. It's not surprising. I'm an economist. I've been doing it for a long time. So the economics chapter, you might not agree on it. And we did get a very conservative review the other day. You might have seen, Barry, that really said that I was blaming fundamentalism on market fundamentalism, the overall decline in democracy on market fundamentalists. If the guy had read the chapter, it's on anti-market fundamentalism. It's the progressives who believe capitalism is the inherent problem and we can never have justice. And that's what we take on. But anyway, Saul has been doing literature for a long time. This is his 20th book, right? So, they might not agree, and including the reviewer in the Wall Street Journal took some issue on how he characterizes literary criticism. But, this guy is the world's expert on Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. They're going to give him a certain amount of latitude. We did a lot of research on political science. Neither of us are trained that way, but we teach it and we've learned a lot. But then there's religion. And we thought, Barry, about not having a religion chapter in there because what's our standing? I'm an econometrician. He's a literary critic. Why are we writing about how do you interpret, the Hebrew Bible in particular? In fact, we had an op-ed, Barry, I don't know if I sent it to you a couple of weeks ago, that was syndicated in the Jewish press called, "When do you have the chutzpah to rewrite the Torah?" And, but I do Bible studies every week. I observe Shabbat, this is near and dear to my heart. The theologians think it's naive and everybody else thinks it's ridiculous like you do. So at the last minute, it's a long enough book, 511 footnotes, 320 pages. I said, Saul, maybe we should get rid of the chapter on religion. And he said, no, fundamentalism comes from the interpretation of religious text. Leave it in. And I have sort of mixed feelings about it. But Barry, I'm not surprised. It's a long, tough chapter on, when you believe holy text and when you rewrite them given current social mores. And that's a difficult topic. And what do we know about that? And some people say, not a hell of a lot. So it was you insisted on keeping that dumb chapter. What do you have to say for yourself? Barry would have a chapter if we had jettisoned it.
Let me answer Barry's question directly about the age of the earth. You sit down and you think that, okay, we live, all of human civilization is a billionth of a billionth of a billionth of a period of the age of the earth, much less the universe, right? All of, the earth is one of trillions of galaxies. Nothing we do makes any damn difference. Now approach ethical problems. You can't. Okay, from a scientific point of view, the world is billions of, that view of the world is right. But if you want to do ethics, you have to pretend, for the sake of argument, that people matter, that what happens on the earth is of consequence, right? You pretend it for that, doing that sort of question, right? That's, I think, what we're saying. You can't do that sort of question unless you put yourself in the perspective where human life and the earth matter. And you don't get that from an astronomical point of view.
And Barry, as you know, one of the great things about human beings is the ability to have two opposing thoughts in our minds at the same time and still go forward. That's a quote from Saul.
Well, from Keats, so I think we know. But in this case, we're thinking of both Tolstoy and Wittgenstein, right? Who both thought that science is not a master key for handling everything. And therefore, you can't approach certain questions like meaning through science, even if you know that from a scientific point of view, the earth is a certain age. If you're going to do geology, you better take that into account. If you're going to dig for oil, you better take geology into account. But if you're going to ask ethical questions, no, you don't want to start there. You want to say, let's bracket that. When we do science, that's what we do. But when we ask ethics, we put ourselves in a world that, Greek mythology, Greek tragedy, the Bible, Buddhist scriptures, something like that imagines. And to do that, you pretend for a while that, the sky is the sky, that the earth is the center of things. Of course, it isn't in a scientific, but you pretend it because that's the only way you can get a hold on the ethical problems.
Let's see, I'm seeing something on the screen.
That's me, Barry. You have time for one more question before we go to the audience Q&A.
Okay, great. And we will continue that discussion over a lot of your preferred alcohol sometime. But let me just put my footnote. I want to be clear. I'm not suggesting that you need to give up belief in a divine being or anything like that. So we'll continue that discussion. But what I'm really saying is certain questions are scientific questions. End of story. Certain questions may or may not be only ethical questions. I think they are. And, I read that part really carefully. And let me just say, especially to Saul, I spent half of my graduate school days reading the skeptics, especially Hume. Couldn't do the work I'd do if I hadn't. One of my dissertation advisors was Richard Popkin. So you summarize very well in the book, Hume's skeptical argument about the Bible. So I'll just leave it there. You can imagine where I would go with that, right? I think he was pretty much on the money. Okay, last question, which I suspect is on the minds of some people watching, certainly, and if not, I'm going to ask it anyway. So, what can people watching, people interested in this, do to counter the fundamentalisms that you decry in the book? What can we do aside from encouraging everybody to read the book? Which is a good thing.
That wouldn't be the end of the world, Barry. But I'll end up where I said before. We should look in the mirror and stop criticizing everyone else and say, what are your fundamentalist beliefs? And I believe in free markets. With some government intervention. That's the way I was trained years ago in graduate school. That's the way my research is and the way my teaching has been for 42 years. And, are there really, I was at a call, Barry, I don't think I mentioned this to you, but with a group of presidents of prestigious private colleges and universities. And one of them really surprised me. We're talking about, could we win people over if we became greater agents of mobility, intergenerational mobility, higher power. And then finally, this one person said, you're just ignoring the reality. As long as we have capitalism, we're going to have extraordinary injustice. And what we really need to do is to work to undermine the system of capitalism. And I couldn't even, I'm a fundamentalist there, Barry. I couldn't even say, well, is there any evidence there is any other way to allocate scarce resources? And, is this really what you're after by increasing marginal tax rates up to the 80%? Or is this, I was speechless. One of you probably could have answered and had a debate, but I'm too fundamentalist there. So the first thing is to realize, what are the things that you should put on the table? And the other thing is to adopt a certain amount of humility and to really honestly engage. And I think it's, I don't know, Betsy might not like when you watch Fox News, and now Juan Williams is gone and Donna Brazil is gone. So maybe Fox News, before the rabid loonies get on late at night, is going to be the whole day. I don't know. But I actually, I don't know how often, Barry, to be fair, I've actually changed my mind on different issues. But, I am impressed that many times they present their view in a much more compelling way than MSNBC presents their view. So,
yes, I think you got the point. You find some issue that you believe in, but is not very important to you. I don't know what the corporate tax rate. I don't know, something that isn't as important to you as other things, right? And on that issue, find out what the smartest people who disagree with you think. Not the dumb. You can always discredit the other side by finding they're idiots or they're madmen, and right. And both sides have it, right. Find out what the smartest people who disagree on that particular issue is that you don't care very much about. Reach the point where you can paraphrase what they say and you consider it. And if you start with that and appreciate that, well, right or wrong, or maybe halfway, even if they're wrong, it's rational, then you sort of expand that to the next most, that you care about a little bit more. And gradually you'll realize that, it's sort of like when I was growing up and neighborhoods were segregated, you could think anything you wanted about somebody of another race because you never met them. They never presented themselves. You can't do that when you know them. They present themselves. You can't characterize them in a way that they immediately recognize as ridiculous. You need to do the equivalent with, people you disagree with. And you have to think that, listen, the larger thing you are trying to do is have a society where people don't hate each other, where democracy flourishes, where, you can talk to each other, which is able to act together for a common purpose. And, where in the long run, the fundamental values of freedom and democracy will act to your benefit too. and you need to preserve them. Take that as your prime value, not your position on one issue or another, and then start working in that way. Another way that, of course, works, for some people I know is, study Russian history. If you've got the czars in the 19th century with one, extreme, intolerance, and the Bolsheviks in the 20th, if you study that, you begin to see why those, fundamentalist type ways of thinking are disastrous, right? What to learn from Russia is that it's not a lesson, it's an object lesson. Whatever Russia has done historically, don't do, but do what its writers say, because they're the ones who, understand it.
May I take the floor for a moment to first thank you guys. It really is so interesting. But I have a couple of questions that I would put, maybe three. As a lawyer, just one more question, Your Honor. I'm interested, first of all, in process, which is a usual thing that we like, our audiences like to hear. How did you guys decide to write this? And at that moment of COVID, did you know you'd be so lucky to see people warring over wearing a mask or not wearing a mask? Second, I don't think you gave a good enough flavor of the importance of the literature in the presentations that you make in the book. And third, I'm a little unsure about your timing. President Schapiro, when you began, it sounded like the world had changed quite recently. But when I read the discussion about, the Erasmus versus Luther debates, I do have a sense that we're on a continuum which started long ago. So I guess you can answer any of those in any order or decline and make up your own question and answer it. But those are things that.
Let me start with the first one, a little bit about the history of the book, and then Saul can talk a little bit about literature. And then together we can talk about, how did we get into this mess and how recently. So Saul and I teach fortunately, a popular undergraduate class. We've done it, I think now, Saul, we've done it 11 years and together. And we've had over 1,200 students during that period of time. And it's really a course on dialogue and trying to learn from each other. One of the big themes was the title of our previous book, Sense and Sensibility, CENTS, What Economics Can Learn from the Humanities. And trying to, we believe, and I don't know what you think about that, Barry, I think sociology actually reaches out in a less imperialistic way than my field, economics. Economists do work on history, they do work on psychology, they do work on sociology, but they never read the literature. There's a lot of evidence that we cite in that book that they never cite the literature because they never read it, whereas some other fields actually really do learn. So it's a course on dialogue and learning. And the first book, Barry had a chapter in there, a wonderful chapter. It was on predicting the future of the US and the world 25 years out. And, what you can learn in terms of the history of really bad predictions. And part of it is humility, part of it is be interdisciplinary, part of it is to truly engage with one another. And finally, Saul, part of it is not to be so damn confident. Confident as a statistician, I say the confidence interval around a point estimate is enormous. So that was that. And, we started with the Fabulous Future book that we edited, and then we did Sensibility, and now Minds Wide Shut. So I think of it as a continuation of an undergraduate course, Saul, that we've done and we've had so much fun doing it over the course of more than a decade. So that's a little bit how we got into this. Saul, do you want to talk a little bit about how we use literature in all three books, but particularly this most recent one?
My feeling about how we write is that, Morty comes up with some interesting questions and I do some research to how to argue them, right? And try to, get them to work with what I know or what I can know. And one thing I do know is literature, particularly the great novels. And what impresses me about novels, what I think is their real importance, is not the particular messages that one character or another will say, but what happens to you when you read them. Because what they try to do is get you to feel intellectually and emotionally the world from a point of view very different from your own. You do that with one character and another. They don't tell you to do it. They have you actually practice. You live inside Anna Karenina's head for hundreds of pages. You may not approve of what you may wince at her choice, but you feel them and you feel why she would do them, even if you wouldn't. And then you start wondering, well, maybe I would in that situation, right? And you do that with one character, but with another character. You also empathize with how two different characters misunderstand each other, because you see it from both points of view, from one head to another. It's that practice, in intellectual and emotional empathy that novels give you. And if you get that and then carry it over to the rest of life, you'll be wiser, more open-minded, and maybe even a better person.
And great answer, of course. So, and then in terms of the final question about how did we get here and when did it start? Again, I don't know what you think, Saul, and Barry, you probably know more about it than either of us, but I really think it's been the last 20, 25 years when it became very easy to live in a silo. And I think it's because, the media is sort of bifurcated and, all of a sudden we were in echo chambers, and I don't remember people living in those kinds of echo chambers before. Saul, do you?
Well, yeah, you mentioned the Luther-Erasmus debate. That period of the Reformation was the period when, intolerance by not just Catholics and Protestants, but Lutherans and Calvinists and other Protestants, they were all killing each other. Erasmus was a lonely person there, suggesting, well, we can't be so sure, let's be right. It was precisely that experience of fanatics killing each other that led to the notion of freedom of conscience and tolerance. You have to find a way that we can live together without to. And the Enlightenment idea of difference of opinion and tolerance, that we so much associate with Voltaire and others, that's a reaction to the fanaticism there. And our country was founded on a much more tolerant view. European democracies were, but it's possible to slip back. Germany did, Russia certainly was, where democracy had rather weak legs, would easily slip back. But you can slip back, you can lose it, you can go back to that period. It's not impossible. And I think Morty is right that the slide has been accelerating since, I don't know. Well, I have an issue of the New Republic from the early 1990s saying these attacks on free speech are really dangerous. You know where they could lead? And I could show you this from the early 90s. Well, it's been accelerating since then. Right? It was there, but moving slowly. But it's like a snowball going downhill. It's moving more rapid. That's why when people say, oh, well, the pendulum will swing the other way, I don't see it as a pendulum. Right? It's not wise to comfort yourself with a metaphor as if there was some. I don't see a pendulum here, but I don't see things going towards more tolerance, and not once in the last 25 years. That's why I'm worried.
I think Barry and I are much more optimistic, not to put words in your mouth, Barry, but your great best-selling book, The Culture of Fear, really is about how there's an industry to get us to be afraid and to get us to be pessimistic. So we give money and we buy products and all that kind of stuff. So maybe it's through reading your books over so many years that I've been convinced that, things aren't as bad as people purport them to be. And, again, Saul, whenever they ask about the pendulum swinging back, I say, yeah, I think, history shows intolerance and you come back. And Saul's got that snowball metaphor instead. Things are getting worse and it's going to eventually go off a cliff, a mixed metaphor, but take away the whole town with an avalanche or something. Maybe I'm just a lot more optimistic, maybe because I'm an economist and you're a literary critic.
Partly because you're an economist and I'm a literary critic. I wish literary criticism were like economics, but I think partly because you believe in a benevolent God.
Yeah.
And I don't know about God. I don't know what to think about that, but I do have a really misanthropic view of people. Looking at the 20th century, at the Nazis and the communists, I don't see how you can have much faith in that people are going to do the right thing. So it's your view of God, but my view of recent history, which is coming to play here. I'm a Russian specialist after all, right?
Barry, I'm going to need that drink, not just to discuss the religion chapter, chapter 5, but just to go back in the classroom with Saul and his incredible pessimism.
Before you take that drink, can we answer my friend Scott Stone's question? Otherwise, he won't have a drink with me in the future. I know
Let me read Scott's question for you both. In a world of the tyranny of one, a social media landscape where one voice is as loud as CNN or Fox News, how does fundamentalism survive? Using Saul's analogy, the 53% have already divided into individual units. Now what?
Well, if I can just say one thing is, Scott, you know, the revolution devours its own children. That, of course, is a great line from the French Revolution. But one thing we didn't talk about, Barry, it's kind of interesting. There's almost a begrudging respect for people 180 degrees different. I'm not saying AOC and neo-Nazis are going to go to the prom together or anything, but you know, who they really hate is the 90 degrees different. You know, it's the progressives hate the liberals. The far right hates the rights, the center right. I mean, and it was pretty interesting. And we argue in the book that, you know, it was entirely predictable that, you know, the progressives helped elect Trump in 2016 by not voting for Hillary, Clinton. And, that's in the book. And then, after the book was in press, we had the insurrection and the horrors of January 6th. And one of the takeaways for me, Barry, I don't know about for you, is that when that mob was looking to kill someone, I would have expected them to really have a passion to find Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. They were looking for Mike Pence, and Mike Pence is as conservative a vice president as we've had literally in the century. Pray away the gay and the like, but not conservative. And so the revolution devours its own. And Saul is that, that's one reason I'm optimistic, is that these coalitions usually break up because, whether it's a BDS coalition or whatever it is, because people start turning on each other, and then those groups fracture. And, when it really gets bad, as Saul said before, they all lose their heads. Who's next? You're on you have the purity of the extreme, but then you're not pure enough, and they turn on you next. Saul?
Yes, I mean, that's the danger. I know from, right after the Russian Revolution, the first people who were executed, were arrested, were the liberals. Right? And immediately after that, the other socialists and other Marxists. But within days, Lenin declared the Liberal Party outside the law, which means you could do anything you want to them. And a mob came into their hospital and murdered 2 of them in their hospital beds. And the liberals were amazed. How could you do this? We have been allies of the left all this time. And they had been. They'd supported terrorism. I mean, but you still will lose your head. And we all have an interest in not creating a situation where that would happen. And you can never be sure, even if you think you're on the winning side, that you'll be there very long.
So let me end by thanking everybody for being here. The solution to get the pendulum to move and to stop the snowball rolling downhill is clearly provided in this lovely, interesting, important book, Minds Wide Shut. It is engaging, it's well written, and you'll be the better for having read it and bought it at Chevalier's. So thank all of you for being here tonight. This was really a wonderful, interesting evening, and I'm made better by your presence. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bert. And Barry, you're the best. Thank you so much for taking your time to read one more of our book and to moderate a wonderful discussion. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you for including me. Thanks.
Everybody.